Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the backdoors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC SciFi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. My name is Sarah, and I am not your usual host. As you may have noticed, we've been replaying some episodes, and if you listen to Ryan's other show, Weird News, you may have also heard that he has moved on to another opportunity, and we wish him all the best in that. We thank him for his time here on the SciFi Podcast. As we are between hosts, I thought rather than replaying one of the old sci-fi episodes, I would do something a little different today. I am the host of the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I've actually done some interviews with some sci-fi authors. So we talk usually about television or movies or those types of things on the Sci-Fi Podcast, but hey, they're sci-fi books, and I know some of you out there are readers. So today I'm going to play an interview with author Curtis C. Chen, who is the author of the Kangaroo series. I'll explain the series in the episode that is forthcoming, so let's go ahead and turn now to that episode. So today we are going to be speaking in a few moments with author Curtis C. Chen. He has written two books. The first one is called Waypoint Kangaroo, and the second one is Kangaroo 2. They are part of a series. Kangaroo 2 comes out next week on Tuesday, June 20th, and these are science fiction books. They are set in space, and I'm going to be honest with you, I love science fiction. I watch science fiction. I grew up watching Star Trek with my dad. I grew up watching and loving Star Wars. I watched a bunch of other science fiction movies and TV shows, but whenever I would try to read science fiction, I just couldn't manage to get into it. There was something about there was something about all the science that I couldn't quite ever read through and figure out. And so eventually I just gave up. I mean, I love the space stories. I love the kind of otherworldliness of science fiction. You know, in a lot of ways, it's very similar to fantasy, but you don't have to understand magic, right? I felt like I had to pay way too much attention to the science portion of science fiction. And science was not my strong suit in high school. I was okay at it. I didn't get terrible grades in it or anything, but not my best subject. So eventually I gave up on science fiction. So when I agreed to do, or when I set up this interview with Curtis Chen, I knew I was going to read science fiction, and I was both excited and a little bit terrified because I had to go back into this genre that I'd been avoiding for so long. And I'm so glad that I was able to do this interview because these books are wonderful. Yes, it's science fiction. Yes, there are a few things that I didn't necessarily understand, but one of the things that we talk about in the interview is that there's a few things in this world that he has created that no one really understands. So you don't feel so bad when you don't understand exactly how something works in this world. I love this because the books are adventures. They involve a main character named Kangaroo, who is a secret agent. He is not a great secret agent. He's not terrible, but he gets himself into situations that he doesn't always extricate himself from so effectively. He is a little bit sarcastic. He is a little bit snarky. He's very human, which I appreciate. He doesn't always do everything right, but he always tries to do the right thing according to his code of ethics, and he is a delightful character. These books are really, really wonderful. As I said, the first one is Waypoint Kangaroo, and it is out. You can read it already. And then Kangaroo 2 comes out next Tuesday, June 20th, so I highly recommend. You don't have to read Kangaroo Waypoint Kangaroo first. They are designed, as Mr. Chen will say in the interview, to be fairly, you can read them. You don't have to read them in order. You can pick up the story pretty well without reading them in order, but they're both very good. So if you want to read them in order, and you've got a week to read the first one before you go pick up the second one next Tuesday. So let me give you the blurb about Kangaroo 2. This is from the description on Amazon. It says, set in the same world as Waypoint Kangaroo, Curtis C. Chen's Kangaroo 2 is bursting with adrenaline and intrigue in this unique outer space adventure. On the way home from his latest mission, secret agent Kangaroo's spacecraft is wrecked by a rogue mining robot. The agency tracks the bot back to the moon, where a retired asteroid miner, codenamed Clementine, might have information about who's behind the sabotage. Clementine will only deal with Jessica Chu, Kangaroo's personal physician and former military doctor once deployed in the asteroid belt. Kangaroo accompanies Jessica as a courier, smuggling Clementine's payment of solid gold in the pocket universe that only he can use. What should be a simple infiltration is hindered by the nearly 1 million tourists celebrating the anniversary of the first moon landing. And before Kangaroo and Jessica can make contact, lunar authorities arrest Jessica for the murder of a local worker. Jessica won't explain why she met the victim in secret or erased security footage that could exonerate her. To make things worse, a sudden terror attack puts the whole moon under lockdown. Now Kangaroo alone has to get Clementine to talk, clear Jessica's name, and stop a crooked scheme which threatens to ruin approximately 1 million vacations. But old secrets are buried on the moon, and digging up the past will make Kangaroo's future very complicated. See, even just the explanation, the blurb of the book makes me, hopefully you, want to read it. It's fun. It's, it's a little bit of secret agent. It's a little bit of science fiction. There's a little bit of mystery involved. Kangaroo has to solve the problems that happen in the book and figure out what is going on. They're wonderful. I loved them. I highly recommend them. I'm going to stop babbling about them now because I would much rather you listen to Curtis Chen talk about his work than listen to me sort of babble on about how much I loved them. But I did love them. So without further ado, let's turn now to my interview with author Curtis C. Chen, who joined me via Skype from his home in Portland. Hi, Curtis. Thank you so much for joining me. How are you today?
Good. Thanks for inviting me, Sarah.
You're welcome. We are here today to talk about your new book that's coming out, Kangaroo 2. But before we talk about the book, I would love for my listeners to just get to know you a little bit. So whatever you feel comfortable sharing about yourself, we'd love to hear.
Okay, sure. I'm Curtis Chen. I'm living in the Portland, Oregon area right now. I used to be a software engineer, and now I'm a freelance writer. And this is my second novel. Most of my other free time, other than writing, is spent organizing Puzzle Pint, which is a monthly event that happens in bars around the world now. So yeah,
Okay.
that's basically me in a nutshell. Yeah,
Okay.
It's mostly fiction writing right now, which is, I'm really happy that that's sort of taking off, and I'm able to do that.
Yeah. So when did you begin writing? Is it something that you've always wanted to do?
Yeah, I mean, I was always interested in, stories from a very young age. I started reading pretty early. My parents would read to me. My mother was a public librarian for most of her career, so she was always, very much into my sister and me reading, and she would bring books home for us that she thought we would like. So from a very young age, probably sometime in grade school, I started thinking about writing my own stories, and wasn't very good at it at first, but kept at it, and eventually it started working out. My first short fiction was published in 2006, and then the first novel came out last year, 2016.
Mm-hmm. In terms of genres, have you always been interested in more of the science fiction, or did you did you write in other genres before?
Yeah, it's always been science fiction, fantasy, pretty much. I was I was very much into science fiction from a very young age. One of the first TV shows I ever saw was Star Trek, and the first movie I ever saw in the theater was Star Wars. So that was a pretty strong influence from the very start. And then I got into, science fiction books. I was really into Asimov's robot stories for a long time. And then as I started reading more, I found, other authors, other genres. So lately I've been getting into more fantasy. And that's been really cool too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's also a little bit of a mystery element to the Kangaroo books because he's he's not a detective, but he does some detective work. Is that a genre you were also interested in?
I mean, I've read stuff in the genre. I've never had a huge interest in it, but I mean, a lot of stories have mystery elements, as you pointed out. And certainly there was a period in high school when I was very much into spy fiction, and that can have sort of the mystery element because you don't know, who's working for who sometimes. There are a lot of secrets and, people are lying to each other about things. But I do remember, in high school, the theater company at my high school would do plays, and a couple of those plays were things like Agatha Christie's The Mousetrap, and so then I started looking at those too. So that was always, it was interesting in a different way, because mysteries are sort of more puzzly in that way, where the reader can kind of try to figure out what's happening as the story goes along. And I understand that's changing recently because I've read some analyses of how the mystery genre has changed and diversified, and now there are all these different kinds of mysteries. But one thing is that readers have become so savvy about you read a mystery and the author puts clues in there, but they don't want to give away the ending, but they want to give away enough that you can maybe figure it out. That wasn't really an issue for me because I never really wanted people to know everything. And because Kangaroo is all first person, it was sort of easier to hide things from that character that he wouldn't possibly know or wouldn't be able to reason out over the course of the story.
Tell us a little bit about Kangaroo. Some of my listeners will have read the first book. Some of them won't. So just tell us a little bit about Kangaroo as a character.
Okay, sure. So Kangaroo he's a spy, and he's in the future, so there's spaceships and things. And he also has, Kangaroo is his code name, because he has the ability to open a portal into an empty parallel universe, a pocket universe, where he can hide anything. The catch is that inside the pocket, it looks like deep space. So there's no air, no light, no heat. So, things will freeze eventually if you leave them in there too long. If you put a person in there, they should really be in a spacesuit if you want them to survive for more than a few minutes. But that's the reason he was recruited to be a spy, because he can basically smuggle anything anywhere, as long as he can fit it through, the portal that he opens into the pocket. But otherwise, he's not that interested in all the other spy stuff, like doing all the training or learning about, weapons or whatever. He gets to, go to space and other planets and, see cool things, and then just has to sort of, carry stuff with him. So there's this, so I wanted to sort of have fun with the character in that way, where, he's the only one who can do this. Like, no one else in the world has, this ability or anything like it. But I wanted him not to be totally dedicated to that job, even though it's kind of the only thing he's been able to do, because he was recruited at a very young age. So he's kind of grown up inside the agency, this spy agency, and doesn't really know any other. Well, there's a lot of backstory there, but sorry, I'm trying to keep this short. But
no, you're doing great.
So I wanted him to be a little snarky, a little sarcastic, because he knows he's special and he can get away with things. But at the end of the day, like, he is sort of still beholden to these people who really control his life in a lot of ways.
And I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I do have to interrupt every once in a while and go to a commercial break. So we'll be back right after this with more of the interview with author Curtis C. Chen. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC SciFi podcast, and we'll be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC SciFi podcast. You're listening to an episode that originally aired on the GSMC Book Review podcast. It's an interview with author Curtis C. Chen about his Kangaroo series. So let's go ahead and get right back to that interview. What was your inspiration for this character and his story?
So the character in particular probably came from a lot of different things that I've read or shows that I've seen. Just sort of, I wanted him to be kind of a younger character who was not necessarily as cynical as some, there's a lot of spy stories out there, and I kind of had that in mind, that I wanted to not do the same kinds of things exactly that have been done before, and also to subvert some of the tropes of that genre, especially all the James Bond stuff, where the main character is hyper competent at a lot of stuff and very confident in his own abilities. And I wanted Kangaroo to be a different kind of person than that. The pocket in particular, that came from, actually, the original idea came from a comic cartoon that I read when I was very, very young. It's something out of Japan called Doraemon, and it had been translated in Chinese. So I was born in Taiwan, and I lived there for the first 5 years of my life. And my grandfather owned a bookshop for a while, so I read a bunch of these comics. And in Taiwan, it's called Xiaodingdang, and the character is a robot cat from the future.
That's awesome.
Who comes back in time to help the grandfather of his owner in the future, because he's kind of this dorky kid who's bad at school and needs help with a lot of things. But so Doraemon has this. I believe the canonical English translation is a fourth dimensional gadget pocket. Is literally a pouch, like on his abdomen, like a marsupial animal would have, and he pulls stuff out of it. And so in the cartoon, it's sort of very loose in terms of the physics of. I mean, there's time travel already, but in terms of he can pull anything of any size out of the pocket, and it just expands to its normal size once he gets it out of there. And for Kangaroo, when I was thinking about, okay, how might this actually work in a more realistic setting for an adult novel, I spent a bunch of time thinking about the physics of how that could work. So what does the portal look like? What are the limitations on how Kangaroo can use it? All that kind of stuff. Yeah. So it was a big mix of ideas, and sort of came together after a while.
Okay. Is there anything you would consider to be autobiographical in the series, either in the series or in terms of Kangaroo himself?
Nothing specifically autobiographical. I mean, I think a lot of the dialogue is just sort of naturally how I talk. Although I did, make an effort to, make different characters sound different, so that, they're not all the same person kind of thing. There's one thing that I sort of snuck in to Kangaroo's character, which is that he grew up watching all these 20th century TV shows and movies.
Right.
For reasons that aren't really important to the story, but it was sort of a way for me to be able to make jokes that, the readers now are going to understand, even though they're not necessarily going to make sense in the future. But then that also gave me another opportunity for Kangaroo to, be funny in that he makes all these jokes that no one else gets.
Right.
And he then has to explain them, which makes it even worse. So, yeah. So that was fun to play with too.
Yeah, I love that about his character. He's funny, just no one really finds him funny because they don't quite understand him.
Right, exactly.
Which makes him funnier to the reader.
Yeah, because I think we've all been there. It's like, what,
oh, yeah.
You don't know this? Like, no, it's great. Let me explain it to you. Well, no, that doesn't help. Sorry.
Right. That just makes it worse. All right, so the second book is coming out next week, which is really exciting. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about the second book. Whatever you want to say, in terms of, you don't want to give too much away, but how it's different from the first book, just whatever you want to tell us about that second book.
Yeah, so Kangaroo 2 is the second book. It's spelled Too, for reasons that will become clear as you read it. It is a little different than the first one. And one of the things I was able to do, so with the first book, like it was my first novel that got published. So I did a lot of work on it over the years and learned a lot of things along the way. And one of the things I started out with was, when I started writing that story, I very, on purpose, decided to limit the setting. So it mostly takes place on this one spaceship. It's a big ship, but it's one sort of one limited location. And in the second book, I wanted to stretch a little bit more. So it takes place in more different kinds of places. It's on the moon. That's not really a spoiler. And people do sort of travel around the moon because it's in the future. So it's been colonized and there are people living there, working there, a lot of tourists because, it's the moon. So, there's all the Apollo landing sites and historical space stuff, museums now. So that was kind of fun to play around with, a wider geography and to think about, okay, so what is it going to be on the moon in this future? What are things that, would be interesting for him to go look at, or what are things that could go wrong in all these different places?
And the series does take place at sort of an undetermined distance in the future. Before you started, how much world building had you done? So how much did you know about this future universe before you started?
Yeah, I thought a fair amount about that. I sort of deliberately don't specify what year it is in either book, although I have an idea sort of in my own head for various reasons. Because I wanted, everyone has different ideas about the future, right? And how long it's gonna, take us to get to Mars or whatever, or, start, mining asteroids for whatever. So I didn't want that to be something that would throw a reader out of the story and oh, that's, way too soon, or oh, that's way too far in the future. We'd have much more advanced technology than this then. So I'm you can imagine whatever you want. And that's fine. It doesn't really matter to the story. It just matters that, it is, a decent amount of time from now. And I did have specific ideas about the level of technology I wanted. I didn't want, even though I love Star Trek, I didn't want it to be that far out where a lot of the technology is almost magical. Just sort of, press a button and, lots of things will happen. Right. I wanted, especially in the first book, I wanted there to be things that would go wrong and it would be very, very difficult to fix. And I think that probably comes a lot from having been an engineer for a long time. I was in software, but I knew people who worked in hardware and hear about their problems and knew about my own problems, with computers. So I did want to have that kind of feel, and hopefully that makes it a little more grounded science fiction and makes it something that readers now can relate to more, because we all have problems with computers and machines and our cars and whatever. So I did want there to be more advanced technology, but I didn't want it to be magical, and I wanted it to fail for very specific reasons and then have to get fixed by the characters in the story, in certain ways that would seem, plausible and was something that, people reading it now would understand. Like, okay, I don't know exactly how that works, but I can understand how something like that might work. Like this technology doesn't exist yet, but it feels right in terms of how everything fits together.
Did you do a lot of research in terms of the science part of the science fiction?
On some things, yes. I definitely, for the first book, I had to do some math on how long it might take to get from Earth to Mars and how orbits work and all that. Even though I do have kind of magical engine that will make your ship go really, really fast. And I kind of hand wave how that works. And in book 2, I actually did a bunch of research on how far apart things are on the moon and how long it might take to get there, given what kind of transportation you have. And so there's sort of, time issues there too. And then in the first book, there's also I don't have anything going faster than light in this world, so people are still dealing with things that that NASA deals with right now, they send a space probe out to Mars or out to Saturn. There's a time delay for the signal to get back here, so you can't really remote control things in real time. It's going to take hours for something to get out, to Jupiter or Saturn, and then more hours for it to come back. So I still have those kinds of issues. And when he's on the moon, it's not really a long delay. But when they were going to Mars, there was a several minutes delay, and that was one thing that worked in the story to sort of isolate the people on that ship even more. Even if they can communicate, there's this big time delay. So that's always an issue. Yeah. And then other stuff I just made up, to be honest. The pocket is how does that work? I don't really know. And Kangaroo doesn't really know either, which lets me get away with that. But I do have some stuff that's not in the book that I've sort of worked out in my notes, or how this might be explained by, different kinds of, quantum string theory or whatever. But it's something that I don't expect to get into in the books very much.
I like how in the second book they tell him that his brain is weird. They don't really understand how the pocket works, but his brain is weird.
Yeah, right. So that's sort of a background issue throughout all the books. He's the only one who can do this, and they don't know how he does it. So he is important. They want to keep him alive, but they're also always running tests on him when he's not out on the missions. How can we reproduce this in some way? So that's sort of a background running through all the stories.
Sorry, interrupting show host here again, so we can take our second break of the podcast. But when we come back, we'll have the conclusion to this interview with author Curtis C. Chen. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC SciFi podcast, and we'll be right back.
Of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC SciFi podcast and the conclusion to the interview with author Curtis C. Chen. And I know you just finished the second book and that it's just coming out, but what is next for Kangaroo?
For Kangaroo, that's a good question. We don't have a third book plan right now. Okay. I have ideas for that. I'm working on a standalone novel right now. We just sent a proposal for that to one editor, and we're going to see how that goes. But yeah, I definitely have ideas for where Kangaroo could go next. I would love to send him to other planets. So I think the theme is kind of going to be space tourism in a way, because he's going to all these places, and in my mind, like this is something that I've thought about for a few years, is that people want to go do things and see things for fun a lot. So once we have space travel that's fairly easy and affordable, and people can fly around the solar system, what are they going to want to do? Well, they're going to want to go to the moon and look around, go to Mars. So the idea I've been thinking about for a future book is going to Venus, and there's actually so NASA has a group that thinks about very, very advanced future projects that they might do, and they have a video. I think it's on YouTube, and you can find it if you search for NASA Venus balloons, maybe. But they actually have this idea of where Venus has it's a pretty toxic and inhospitable environment below the cloud cover. There are clouds all over Venus, and it's there's acid rain below there and all this kind of bad stuff. But above the clouds, it's very sunny, and you still can't breathe the air, right? It's not good for humans, but you could actually float balloons above the clouds, so it's not raining acid rain on you, and kind of hang out there, and it's always sunny on Venus. You can sort of travel around. So they actually have this video where they have a computer animation of how this might work, where they would send these basically airships over out to Venus and have people just kind of twirling around above the clouds, and you can drop probes down to look at stuff, but you're safe up here, and you'd still need your own breathable air, oxygen and all that. But that is, as far as we know, that is a thing you could actually do. You could have these airships flying around. So, have people who could go there and be tourists, and just, hang out on Venus and sunbathe and, look at whatever. I feel like that's a thing that might happen.
I can only imagine what Kangaroo will get himself into if he goes.
Yeah, so so that's the second part of it, right? And that's kind of what I did with book 2 also, where this is also not a huge spoiler, but he goes to the moon, and there is a retirement community on the moon, because the moon has lower gravity. You need to control the climate anyway because you're building these habitats. So, if you're an elderly person who maybe doesn't get around too well, if you're only in 1/6 the gravity, you might be able to walk without, having a walker or something. Your bones are still going to, lose mass after a few years, but, you're kind of there already. And, meanwhile, you're on the moon. So that was a good idea I started with. Okay, so let's put, this retirement community on the moon, and then how do we get the spy stuff mixed up in that? So it was kind of fun to sort of come up with that story.
Do you have any idea how many books you might have in the series? or is that just up in the air right now?
I've always thought of it as an open-ended series, and ideally, I want each book to be pretty much a standalone. So, like, as long as you knew, 3 or 4 things about the world, you could pick it up and get into it, and not necessarily need all the backstory. But yeah, I mean, I have ideas about where it could go. Kind of depends on what happens with publishing and me in particular. But yeah, I definitely have ideas for several more books, if someone wants to buy them.
Oh, I want to read them. Not that that's going to make a difference, but I really love the first two. So I would continue reading about Kangaroo's adventures. In terms of writing, do you keep to a certain schedule? Do you have a favorite place that you write? Anything about your writing habits?
Yeah, I think so. In general, I think writing habits are very personal, and everyone kind of has to figure out what works for them. So for me, I don't necessarily have a set time. I find I'm generally better later in the day. I'm not one of those morning writers, but I can stay up pretty late and continue to be productive. And, I have an office at home. I also am a member of a co-working space locally, so sometimes I'll go into town and do that. I have a regular weekly write-in at a local pub that has, a lot of tables. And that's a nice way to sort of go and get some work done and also see other people and be able to talk to them about writing and, just catch up on things. Because it can be very solitary writing, because you have to do it by yourself. You can get feedback from people at certain points, but mostly it's a pretty lonely job. So I've been working on making more reasons for myself to get out and see other people and other writers especially, and just see what they're working on, how they're dealing with, whatever story issues or business issues are happening in their lives. And that's really good too. Portland's a really, really good town for, creative people like that.
You talked a little bit about the reading science fiction as a kid. When you have time to read now, what are you reading?
It's still mostly science fiction and fantasy. Right now I'm reading To Like the Lightning by Ada Palmer, which is really, really interesting. What else have I read recently? I've been reading some nonfiction stuff, kind of for research for this book proposal. Other science fiction and fantasy, I think. I really loved Michelle Baker's first 2 books, Borderline and Phantom Pains. And now I'm kind of bummed because I have to wait till next year for the third one.
You hate that?
Yeah, but those are really good. I would definitely recommend those. That's sort of an urban fantasy thing, but yeah, the first one was nominated for a Nebula Award this year, so that's Borderline. What else have I read lately? I tell everyone to go read Nora Jemison's books. N.K. Jemisin, The 100,000 Kingdoms is great. That whole series, her current series, is I believe it's Broken Earth. The first one was The Fifth Gate, which won the Hugo, and the second one is The Obelisk Gate, which is up for a bunch of awards this year. She's fantastic. Pretty much everything she writes is great. Yeah, I could go on, but yeah, those are things that have really sort of captured my imagination lately. Yeah, and like I said, I've been trying to get more into fantasy because I didn't read a lot of that when I was younger. But now sort of being part of the community more, I really am making an effort to get to know what's out there, what people are really into. Oh, Uprooted, Naomi Novik. That's also really good. That won a bunch of awards last year.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you'd like people to know about your books?
Yes, there is one thing. It's that I was able to talk my publisher into hiding a puzzle in the book covers.
Right,
so,
I read something about that.
Yeah, so both on Waypoint Kangaroo and on Kangaroo 2, the cover image has a little puzzle hidden in it, and you can see the images online and just solve it that way. And they both lead to online things that give you a little bit of a taste of the story, and they're interactive. So people have enjoyed them, and they'll be up indefinitely. Okay. So yeah, if you want to check out that, they are online, waypointkangaroo.com and kangaroo2.com, which is the number 2, just to make things more confusing.
And speaking of online, where can people follow you online? Social media, or do you have, there's obviously those websites, but do you have an author website?
Yeah, my author website is just curtiscchen.com with the middle initial. I'm on Twitter as Curtis C. Chen, and I think the website has links to other stuff, Goodreads, Facebook, all that kind of stuff.
Those were my questions. I really enjoyed having you here. Thank you so much again for joining me.
Okay, thanks, Sarah.
And again, the book comes out on Tuesday, a week from today, right?
Yep, June 20th. We're doing a book launch in San Francisco if people are around there. Yeah, it'll be at the Bindery, which is the Booksmith's new event space in the Haight.
Cool. Are you doing anything in Portland?
Yeah, we'll be at Powell's Books at Cedar Hills Crossings on June 27th. We'll be in Seattle on June 29th at University Bookstore, and then back in San Francisco July 9th, which is a Sunday, for SF in SF at the American Bookbinding Museum. And I'm doing all those events with other authors because that's been really fun. So on the 20th, I'll be in San Francisco with Ariel Waldman, who is a space science blogger. I'm doing Portland and Seattle with Jason Huff, who's wrote The Darwin Elevator, that whole series, and Zero World. And on July 9th, I'll be with Megan O'Keefe, who wrote Breaking the Chains, and the third book in that trilogy is out this year.
Fun. It sounds like you've got a lot of good things coming up. You'll be traveling and meeting with great people. So I am.
Yeah. And I suppose I should also mention that I'll be in Seattle on the 24th for the Locus Awards, because Waypoint Kangaroo is actually up for the first novel category this year, which is really cool. I don't expect to win it all because the other books in that category are amazing, but it really is an honor just to be nominated and included.
That's great. Congratulations. That's wonderful.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and it's a fun time. That's always a fun weekend to do.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, congratulations on the second book. It's great. Everyone should go out and check it out. I mean, they should read both of them because they're both fun. I loved both of them. So thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. And good luck with all of your, with your second book coming out and with all of your events.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah.
And even though he was here quite some time ago, I still want to thank Curtis C. Chen for coming on to originally the GSMC Book Review podcast. I'm very glad that I got to share this episode with you. Maybe you love sci-fi books and you've been looking for something new to dive into. Hopefully this will be a series that you will give a shot, and maybe you will like it as much as I did. I love Kangaroo as a character. I love the series, and it really got me reading more science fiction because I avoided reading science fiction for a long time, even though I love watching it. I hadn't read it for a long time, and I'm starting to read more of it, which I really appreciate. So thank you, Kangaroo. Thank you, Curtis C. Chen. And thank you, sci-fi listeners. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope you will join us again next time for another episode of the GSMC SciFi podcast. Thank you.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. From movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.